Hi everybody, I'm Sue Hampel, and this is the fourth lecture in the course on women during the Holocaust. Tonight I'll be talking to you about the heroism of women resistors. But before I get started, I'd like to remind you of where we've come in the course. So in week 1, you had Bree, and she articulately spoke to you about the reasons that we decided to have a course on the topic of women in the Holocaust. And we study this topic to humanise the individual and to add nuance to each and every story. Bree emphasised the double jeopardy that women faced in the Holocaust because they were Jewish and because they were women. And as we know, women were the future bearers of Jewish children. In Bree's first lecture, she gave a couple of quotes for you to consider. Oneg Shabbat historian Emanuel Ringelblum. He understood the role of women very, very well, and he issues us a challenge because this is what he writes. The future historian will have to dedicate an appropriate page to the Jewish woman in the war. She will take up an important page in Jewish history for her courage and steadfastness. By her merit, thousands of families have managed to surmount the terror of the times. Historian Raoul Hilberg wants us to understand something important, that the final solution was intended by its creators to ensure the annihilation of all Jews. But the road to annihilation was different because men were affected as men and women were affected as women. So that's what Bree discussed in her first lecture and why we need to look at this topic through a gendered lens. In week 2, Bree focused on women in ghettos and in hiding. She gave us a macro-level understanding of women's experiences by focusing on the Warsaw Ghetto. At the micro level, Bree gave us a number of different insights into specific women. You met Cecilia, Angela, Edina, Janina, Lucia Haberfeld, Sarah Saroni, and Duncan Schnall. And the whole idea was for you to understand that it is important to see each person's individual experience. And this quote is also really, really interesting when Bree honed in on the Ringelblum archives, which I'll be looking at as well today. And while the Nazis ordered that Jewish women be excluded from serving in the Judenrat, there was a woman called Cecilia Slepak, and she did research, and her research reveals that women occupied important roles in healthcare, social welfare, and education. They were particularly prominent in the house committees, which organised each building. Women raised funds for charitable purposes, not the least soup kitchens, through a wide range of activities ranging from direct taxation to even gambling parties. So Bree focused on the story of women and the arduous task that was set before them as somehow trying to survive and look after their families while incarcerated in the ghettos. Last week, I spoke about some very, very difficult material. And what is really interesting and important here is that women's stories and the stories that I spoke about last week document different horrors within the same hell. I talked a lot about the selection process, and here is a testimony from Yad Vashem of Tova Berger. And in her testimony, she writes, "They told us to get undressed and they shaved us. They shaved my beautiful blonde hair and my 2 sisters' hair, and we were standing naked before the soldiers. And for me, it was a shock because I was a religious girl. I was never undressed in front of a man, and they made all kinds of dirty jokes about our bodies. And they looked at us, and I was standing there shivering naked without hair on my body, and I was exposed." I also talked about a lot of different stories and different things that happened to women during the camps. We talked about pregnancy, and the example is the lady on the right, Ruth Elias. And you might recall that I discussed how she delivered a beautiful big blonde girl, but Mengele ordered her breast be bound. And as Mengele said, we can see how long a newborn baby can survive without food. And she did survive, Ruth Elias, and went on to have two children and 6 grandchildren in Israel after the war. We talked about medical experiments, sexual violence, especially in Auschwitz, is what we also discussed. And I told you stories about Kitcha Altman, Lily Jacobs, the lady who found the Auschwitz album, the amazing twins Annetta and Stephanie, Batsheva Dagan, who was a survivor of many camps, including Ravensbrück, which was a women's camp, Eva Kor, who was a young girl. She was 11 years old when Mengele experimented on her and her twin sister, and the power of friendship. And that was one of the things that I also talked about, the importance of having a Schwesterlager or a camp sister. So what are we going to do today? So what we see today is that among the horrors of the Holocaust, we see so many examples of remarkable resistance. And I mean spiritual resistance, psychological resistance, armed resistance. And I'm going to look at the heroism of different women through a whole lot of different settings, through the ghettos, through the camps, as partisans in the forest, from Palestine, and even resistance from the Polish underground and from German women. So these are the names of people that you're going to meet in tonight's lecture, and I'm sure that you'll find it an uplifting and inspiring lecture to listen to. Well, I hope you do. So I guess we have to talk about cultural resistance, and especially focusing on the Warsaw Ghetto. Now, Bree did discuss this with you in detail in week 2, but I'm just going to focus on a couple of small stories to exemplify how amazing what the women were. So just to remind you, this is the story about Emanuel Ringelblum's Oneg Shabbat archive. So remember, Emanuel Ringelblum wrote that it was important to record everything with not a single fact omitted, and when the time comes, and it surely will, let the world read and know what the murderers have done. So in November 1940, Ringelblum and his colleagues turned the Oneg Shabbat archive into an organised operation that would include tens of historians, writers and teachers. And the goals of this project were to document the events taking place in Warsaw Ghetto and even all over Europe, to remind future generations of the tragedy that was unfolding at the moment, at that period in time, to gather historical evidence, to record personal testimonies, to present the whole truth, no matter how painful it might be, to inform the world about the atrocities being perpetrated against the Jewish population, and to give a bit of a microcosm of ghetto life, to capture the every single day. So Rachel Auerbach, who you can see in this slide here, was one of the key figures in the archive for a couple of reasons, which I'll go into. So at Ringelblum's initiative, Rachel Auerbach served for 3 years as the director of the soup kitchen in Warsaw. And Ringelblum encouraged her to record her impressions of the events that transpired during the ghetto period. So she kept a ghetto diary, and she also recorded a description and analysis of the hunger in the first 2.5 years of the occupation. And it stands out as one of the most vivid descriptions of hunger during the ghetto period. The soup kitchen was interesting because it was also a meeting point for clandestine schools and youth movements. So Rachel was able to interact with a range of different people, including the ghetto's poorest. And she documented all of these observations because she was determined, like Ringelblum was, to record Jewish history for future generations. It's interesting when she writes about the soup kitchen because it became like this social hub. And I told you before that, the schools were held there, and it was like this secret area for planning the resistance against the Nazis. Rachel actually escaped from the Warsaw Ghetto. She left it for the Aryan side in March 1943, and she was able to survive because her non-Jewish appearance, but also her excellent command in the German language. And when she left, she wrote, "I'm handing over this unfinished essay to the archive, the 5th day of the action. Perhaps such horrors have already occurred before in Jewish history, but such same never. I want to stay alive just to be able to see the moment of revenge. Revenge, revenge, remember. So Rachel, what's interesting about her story is that she presents a Jewish woman's perspective. She's always conscious in her writing about women's participation in the cultural life of pre-war Poland, and she makes it really, really clear that the story that she wants to talk about is her story. And remember, I read a quote to you, and I know Bree spoke about this at length in week 2. She encouraged women to write about women's experiences. And Cecilia Slepak was one of these women that was a remarkable contributor to the Oneg Shabbat archive. She interviewed 16 women, one actually survived, and wrote about their experiences, and that information was included also in the archive. And it actually showed us that the voices of the women that Cecilia had interviewed epitomised the vitality of living, the desire to go overcome the tragedies, and talks about, ordinary things like card games during the long evening curfews, a session at the hairdresser, and a whole lot of other interesting exchanges that Cecilia had had. Unfortunately, Cecilia did not survive the Holocaust, but her writings did. The other interesting thing about Rachel Auerbach is that she was one of 3 people who knew where the actual archives were buried. And the first archive was found in September 1946 under the rubble of the Borochov School in the ruins of the former Warsaw Ghetto. And there were also 10 tin boxes discovered, as you can see one of them in this slide. In December 1952, large aluminium milk cans were also discovered, and there are about 35 to 40,000 documents that were retrieved. There was a third aluminium milk can also buried. That still hasn't been discovered. So most of the archives today are located in the Jewish Historical Institute, which is in Warsaw. Now, Rachel, as you can see from this photograph, was one of the people who was looking through the archives. She, in 1945, is a member of the delegation of the Polish State Committee for the Investigation of Nazi War Crimes on Polish soil. She visited Treblinka and published the historical reporting about the camp, its machinery and its victims. In 1950, Rachel Auerbach moved to Israel, and she realised the importance of gathering testimony from survivors and published a lot of memoirs and this was in the very, very early days. She worked at Yad Vashem and was responsible for the extension and incorporating and initiating new methodologies in testimonial documentation at Yad Vashem. But the interesting thing that you can see the bottom right slide is that she actually testified at the Eichmann trial, which was held in 1961. I'd like you to listen to a very brief testimony from Vladka Mead. So Vladka Mead was originally known as Fagele. Her name actually was Fagele Peltel. She changed her name to make it sound more Polish. She posed as a Christian on the Aryan side of Warsaw, and she was also involved in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. But this is her discussion that I thought you might like to hear about spiritual resistance in the ghetto.
I also belonged at that time in the ghetto before deportation to the Jewish cultural group. And we had lectures with Ringenblum, the historian, Emanuel Ringenblum, and with the teacher Virovsky. And we had some events, cultural events. I also recall they sent me to talk to a group of Jews after the curfew in the ghetto. I spoke at that time about Yoel Peretz, Bonche Schweig, and I recall being in a house after the curfew. I have to go there before and sleep over the night. And it was a big room, 40 or 50 people. the tenants of the house, of the building, and they asked two small children to be outside in case Germans are coming, to have enough time to disperse. And I was talking to the people about parrots. I was a young girl, and I recall how the people were able to follow me, and it was at that time starvation and typhoid and hunger and constantly terror in the ghetto. But nevertheless, such lectures took place in many houses during the ghetto period, and the young people used to go there. And they were asking questions. I don't remember the questions, but I do remember the atmosphere, the elevation, being together with the people and talking about the writer and about the character von Schweig. And this still remains in my memory.
So Vladka Mead there is talking about spiritual resistance in the ghettos and the cultural activities that took place. She is focusing on the Warsaw Ghetto. We know that that's not the only ghetto where there were a lot of cultural activities. Vilna also was quite famous for the cultural activities at the time. So now I'd like to turn to the role of the couriers, and the name for these couriers is the Kashariot. And just to show you how, again, we go back to Emanuel Ringelblum many times during this lecture, because he also recognised the bravery of these women. And he writes in 1942, these heroic girls, the hikers and the frumkers, they are a theme that calls for the pen of a great writer. Boldly they travel back and forth through the cities and towns of Poland. They are in mortal danger every day. They rely entirely on the Aryan faces and on the peasant kerchiefs that cover their heads. The girls volunteer as though it were the most natural thing in the world. They undertake the mission. Nothing stands in their way. Nothing deters them. How many times have they looked death in the eyes? How many times have they been arrested and searched? The story of the Jewish woman will be a glorious page in the history of Jewry during the present war, and the hikers and the frumkers will be the leading figures in this story, for these girls are indefatigable. And they were absolutely amazing. So let me tell you some of the things that these Kashariot did. So the story of the female couriers of Nazi-occupied Europe is a story of resistance that really remained in the shadows, or perhaps been overshadowed by the story of armed resistance in the ghettos of Europe. But it is a story of incredible bravery by a group of Jewish girls as young as 15 years old and women in their late teens and early 20s. These girls braved danger and death to serve as a lifeline between Jewish communities throughout war-torn Europe. Disguised as non-Jews, they transported documents, papers, money, and ultimately ammunition and weapons across borders and into ghettos. The word courier doesn't do these women justice. They were much more than messengers. Sure, they carried mail and information back and forward from place to place. They smuggled forged ID cards, documents, underground newspapers, money into the sealed-off ghettos of Nazi Europe. But they also smuggled guns and grenades and ammunition and other weapons into the ghettos. So, in addition to the strictly messenger part of the job, these girls who risked their lives to move from ghetto to ghetto served a human purpose because they inspired and brought hope and information to Jews who would have been otherwise cut off from the entire world. In the dark days of Europe during the Holocaust, these girls were lifelines that connected Jewish communities and isolated ghettos to each other and the outside world. So it's also interesting to consider why women were used as kashariot, or Jewish couriers. Obviously, a man could be identified as Jewish. He only had to be ordered to drop his pants, and the telltale sign of his circumcision would give him away. Men out on the streets would generate suspicion because they should have been at work. It seemed to be easier for women to be in the streets. They were more likely to speak the local language. A lot of the women who were chosen as couriers were educated in Polish secular schools. A lot of the men at the time might have had a religious instruction in a cheder. The girls, could speak better Polish fluently, and also girls seem to have a bit more intuition, as you'll hear from one of them. I'll show you in a minute. So these are members of the resistance in Białystok, and Frumka Plotnica, you can see here on the right, also was a courier, and she actually died fighting in the Będzin ghetto uprising. So meet Bronka. Bronka Klabansky. She was a courier who connected the ghettos in the area of Białystok and Grodno in Poland. And remember I mentioned to you before, sometimes women seem to be better because of their intuition. Well, that's actually what Bronka thought. In comparison to men, it seems to me that we women were more loyal to the cause, more sensitive to our surroundings, wiser, or perhaps more generously endowed with intuition. And she felt this intuition made her sense when someone on the street was staring a bit too long, or someone could be trusted, or a contact could be a Nazi collaborator, or who intuition told her when to cut and run. So Bronka walked with Mordechai Tenenbaum, the leader of the Jewish resistance in the Białystok ghetto, and she was a primary courier for the Dror Zionist group in 1943. Bronka obtained critical weapons for the ghetto revolt. She gathered intelligence, rescued Jews, saved the secret archive of the Białystok ghetto. She continued her underground activities after the Białystok ghetto was destroyed. And together with other women, they were smuggling weapons and supplies and medicines to the partisans in the forest near Białystok. And a lot of them were actually awarded medals as heroines of the USSR after the war. So Bronka had a good face, as you can see here. She didn't look Jewish, so couldn't be easily identified as a Jew on the Aryan side. She spoke perfect Polish, no trace of a Jewish accent. She had lived among non-Jewish families and her former neighbours she could trust in this endeavour. And she was adventurous and fearless. And at 18, she was young enough to assume that nothing would happen to war. Nothing would happen to her. After the war, she became dedicated to Holocaust remembrance and research. She was a noble and brave woman who did whatever she could, and she was also a member of the Yad Vashem Council. On the right is Havka Folman Rabban, another courier of the Warsaw Ghetto. She also belonged to the Dror movement and was an underground liaison officer, and she travelled to many cities in underground Poland, was involved in a number of uprisings, including a resistance operation that happened in Krakow. And she says one of the most difficult concerns that filled the hearts of Jews was the feeling that the entire world had forgotten about us, that we had no hope and certainly no future. This was loneliness in all its horror. With meagre abilities, we young women worked to ease this feeling of loneliness so it would be less suffocation. So she also is following what I told you, like with Bronka and with Frumka and also with Havka. They brought these messages of hope when they travelled across Poland to the various ghettos. So Jewish armed resistance took place in a lot of different areas. This is just a couple that we have outlined here on the map in front of you. The three that I've been talking about, and I will be talking about, are in Vilna, Białystok and Warsaw. And later we'll talk about also some of the camps where resistance took place. Women played an important role in various resistance activities. So in Poland, we talked about how women were serving in the partisans, but there were also women who helped to smuggle weapons into Warsaw as in preparation for the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And I've talked to you before about Vladka Mead, who was a courier. She's the one that spoke to you. You listened to her testimony before about spiritual resistance and the cultural activities that took place in Warsaw Ghetto and how she even gave a talk. But she writes that the major problem on both sides of the wall was getting weapons to resist the Germans. Deep in every heart, bringing us closer together, was the yearning for vengeance for our families taken to the death camps, for the wrongs and the sufferings we ourselves had borne. And it was a great event for me when I managed to procure my first revolver. So this is the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising that took place in April 1943. The brave fighters here managed to hold the Germans out for quite a long time, longer than even the Germans. The Poles managed to hold out the Germans with the occupation of Poland. But unfortunately, the Germans decided that the only way that they could destroy the ghetto was actually, as you can see here, burn everything from house. They went from house to house to house. So there were people who did escape through the sewers, and Vladka Mead talks about how she was now on the Aryan side. She'd already escaped, and she talks about watching the burning of the Warsaw Ghetto.
While being there at night, I saw the flames of the ghetto. And I saw also certain pictures which were seared in my mind. Some Jews running from one place to the other, and also seeing some Jews jumping from buildings. But I was observing this from a window, and I couldn't do anything. And then flames burst into the ghetto. The Germans couldn't take over the streets. They start putting block after block on fire. They start burning the ghettos, the buildings. And this was the uprising which we, the small group on the Aryan side, we tried to get through, we tried to communicate. We decided even to go into the ghetto to be with them, but everything was in vain. We didn't have any communication. We saw only tanks coming in, tanks going out, or some ambulances going in, and we're listening to the shooting. And in that time it was, we have to let the outside know what is going on.
So that's the testimony of Vladka Mead describing what she was seeing on the Aryan side of the burning of the Warsaw Ghetto. So there were uprisings in so many of the ghettos, as I showed you before. And in Vilna, once they realised that the ghetto had been destroyed, a lot of them fled to the forest and became part of the ghetto partisan movements. And there are quite a few famous people here. So Jewish partisans played a very prominent role when geographical conditions permitted such warfare, and Jews fought in existing partisan units or set up their own. So the decision to join the partisans was often a difficult one because it meant that you would have to abandon your family. But there are a lot of women in the partisan groups. In some areas of Belarus, the Jewish partisan unit sheltered whole families, but Jewish partisans conducted numerous raids. They participated in bombing of railway tracks, bridges and telecommunications. They assassinated Nazi collaborators, carried out revenge killings for the murder of their fellow Jews, and acted as scouts and participated in ambushes with on German units. So this is one of my favourite photos here. So you can see three women. There's one woman, I don't know her name. I couldn't find it anywhere. But Witka Klempner is on the right, and she was one of the famous partisans. And you've got Rushka Korzak. You can see her as well. I've labelled her there, and Abakovna. So this was Abakovna's partisan group, and Witka actually marries Abakovna after the war. They survive, so does Rushka Korzak, and they moved to Israel after the war. One of the most interesting stories about the partisans is the story of Faye Schulman. So, as I've told you, that Jews faced overwhelming odds, and it was very, very difficult to survive. And thousands did resist and join the partisan movement. So Faye Schulman was born to a large family in Lenin, which is in Poland at the time. She learned photography from her brother Moshe and assisted him in his photography business. On August the 14th, 1942, the Germans killed 1,850 Jews from the Lenin ghetto, including Faye's parents, sisters and younger brother. They spared only 26 people that day, and among them Faye for her photographic abilities. The Germans ordered Faye to develop their photographs of the massacre. Secretly, she made copies for herself. During a partisan raid, Faye fled to the forest and joined the Molotov Brigade, a partisan group made mostly of escaped a Soviet Red Army. She was accepted because her brother-in-law had been a doctor and they were desperate for anyone who knew anything about medicine. So she had some basic training from a veterinarian and she worked as a nurse, even though she had zero medical experience. During a raid on Lenin with the partisans, Faye went back and recovered her photographic equipment. So for the next 2 years, she took over 100 photographs. She developed the negatives under blankets and made these sun prints during the day. When she went out on a mission, Faye buried the camera and tripod to keep it safe. And the photographs that are here, and we had a display at the Melbourne Holocaust Museum quite a number of years ago, are images of partisan activity. This one you can see here, and also in this photograph here are some of the photos that she took. And this one here I love because she's unexpectedly, there's a reunion with 3 Jewish men, and they all thought that she had been killed, and you can see the happy reunion here. Now, Faye said that she wants people to know there was resistance. Jews did not go like sheep to the slaughter. She was a photographer. She says, I have pictures, I have proof. She's one of very few Jewish partisan photographers. After liberation, she married Morris Schulman, who was also a Jewish partisan, and they had a great life because you can see she's been decorated for her bravery here. She was decorated as Soviet partisan, but wanted to leave and ended up in Canada, moving there in 1948. She shared her experiences and she actually passed away at the age of 101 in Canada. We have our very own Melbourne partisan story. So you probably know these people. This is Luba Goldberg and Luba Olensky. So Luba Goldberg escaped from the Sokoli ghetto and joined a Russian partisan group in the Branska forest. And in the forest, she met Luba Frank, who was called, later becomes Luba Olensky. And the two sisters, the two Lubas became sisters of the forest, and together they participated in a daring mission when the group detonated a bridge. Luba married and arrived in Australia with Chaim in 1949. Luba Olensky was very, very young. She escaped from a transport to Treblinka. She ended up joining a Jewish partisan unit where she met her future husband, David. She was liberated in 1944 and they arrived in Australia in 1947. And the two Lubas, the sisters of the forest, enjoyed a lifelong friendship together and have both written about their experiences as partisans in the forest. So as I said to you before, that there were uprisings even in the camps and even in the death camps. So we know that there were uprisings in Treblinka, and at our museum, hopefully you've had a look and seen the amazing model of Treblinka that Chaim Steyer made piece by piece, and he was one of, there are about 750 escapees from Treblinka, 50 to 70 survived, and Chaim Steyer came to Melbourne. But Auschwitz-Birkenau also had an act of resistance. So just to remind you, Auschwitz-Birkenau was the largest of the Nazi extermination concentration camps. Over 1 million Jews were gassed there. There are 3 parts to Auschwitz to the Auschwitz complex. There's Auschwitz I, and you can see it on this map here. Auschwitz II is Birkenau. That is the section where most of the European Jews were murdered. Auschwitz III was a work labour camp. Buna Monowitz, Primo Levi and Elie Wiesel were there. And there were also 40 sub-camps. So I'm going to talk to you about Auschwitz II and what happened in Auschwitz II. So this is Rosa Robota. In 1942, Rosa was taken to Auschwitz on a transport from Chekhanov. She was one of the first inmates to be placed in the women's camp in the Birkenau section. In 1943, a Jewish underground group was established in Auschwitz. Rosa joined the group and solicited support for it from many women inmates. In 1944, Rosa helped smuggle tiny amounts of explosives from the ammunition factory in Birkenau where she worked. The explosives were given to the underground in Auschwitz I and to the Sonderkommando men working in the Birkenau crematoria. In October 1944, the Sonderkommando revolted, and during the investigation of the mutiny, Robota and 3 other young women from the factory were arrested. Rosa was the only one who had any useful information about the underground, its members, how it functioned, but in spite of the terrible torture that was inflicted upon her, she did not give a single name. On the 6th of January 1945, only a few weeks before the camp was liberated by the Soviet soldiers, Rosa and her 3 fellow underground members were hanged. It is said that the last words that Roberta actually cried out before she died was Chazak ve'ematz, be strong and of good courage. What is interesting, this is Lusha Haberfeld. And Lusha Haberfeld is a guide at our Melbourne Holocaust Museum. And in this testimony, I found the most amazing story because in her testimony, Lusha talks about the girls resisting, and she actually knew Rosa Robota. And I think this is one of the amazing things about Lusha's story and about our museum. You know, we have survivors who came from every single aspect to do with the Holocaust. You know, whether we talk about the ghettos, whether we talk about the camps, whether we talk about resistance. And Lusha, in this short clip that I'm going to show you now, explains how she knew Rosa and how proud she was of her work. And we also have Lusha's book, Lauferin, The Runner of Birkenau. And I highly recommend that you read that book and learn more about Lusha.
How this uprising came all about was there was a young woman working in the Kleidungskammer whose name was Rosa Robota. And this Rosa Robota with 3 other girls was smuggling dynamite to the men. That's how the uprising came all about. These girls it was a whole operation. They were taking the dynamite from a Jewish woman who were working in a munition factory. And it took them maybe 12 months. Little by little, they smuggled the powder, the dynamite, to the men, powder by powder, you know? It took them a long time in the hems of their frocks, everywhere, you know?
And Rosa Robota did this?
Rosa Robota and 3 other girls. One was Alla Gärtner. The other 2 girls' names I don't know. There was a whole lot of people involved in it. And Rosa Robota was caught.
Was she a friend of yours?
Yes. We were working together in the Kleidungskammer. Although she was older than I was, we became very friendly. She was a very lovely girl. She was in her maybe 20. Very idealistic and a great Zionist. And she was always telling me that how, if she ever survived, she will live in Palestine, which was Palestine there, not Israel. And she was telling me always, you will see one day we'll pay them back. We will pay them back. We'll do something. She always used to tell me that, you know. And that was the uprising.
Now, I've very briefly talked to you about the amazing women. The women who were not the mothers or the caregivers, but the women who were actively involved in resistance. So this is Hannah Senes. And Hannah Senes was born in Hungary. And she made Aliyah and went to Palestine quite early. She was one of 32 Jewish volunteer parachutists from Palestine that the British Army sent behind German lines for resistance and rescue efforts. So she was living in Palestine, she was a poet, she worked on a kibbutz, but when the call came to come behind enemy lines and help to rescue Jews, she volunteered. So on the 7th of June 1944, she was with a group that tried to infiltrate German-occupied Hungary. She was pretty much captured straight away as she tried to cross the border. She was tortured by the Nazis for several months, again never betrayed her colleagues, but she was eventually convicted of treason and executed. But I like to tell her story because she was a brave woman who had already left Hungary and made a new life, but wanted to go back and help her people in whichever way that she could. And we mustn't forget the last part of this talk is about non-Jews who also help Jews. And this is the story of Irena Sandler. So I was fortunate enough to meet Irena Sandler in 2007, and it was the year she was nominated for a Nobel Prize. Unfortunately, she didn't win it. It was given to Al Gore that year. But I had heard a little bit about Irena Sandler, and the Consul General, the Polish Consul General, organised for me to take a couple of students from March of the Living and have a meeting with Irena. So Irena was born and lived in Otwoc, which is quite close to Warsaw. Her father was a doctor, and he always taught her the importance of recognising people as people. It doesn't matter about skin colour. It doesn't matter about religion. People are people, and whenever you can, you have to help them. And she sort of was always ingrained in that. And when she became a social worker and she moved to Warsaw, and when the Warsaw Ghetto was closed, she was very curious about what was happening behind the gates of the Warsaw Ghetto. So she was a social worker, as I told you, but she said she was an expert in typhoid, which she wasn't. But she wanted to go in and see for herself what was happening in the ghetto, and what she saw horrified her. So she joined an organisation called Żegota, and Żegota helped to rescue some Jews during the Holocaust. And with Żegota, she went into the ghettos and she would try and smuggle children out of the ghettos, babies out of the ghettos. So I asked Irena about this, and she said that what she used to do was she would go ride on her bike through and go into the ghetto. She had an Alsatian with her, and the bicycle had a basket on as well. When she would go to the Jewish mothers and say, "Give me your babies," and often the mothers, were reluctant to do so, but she said that she would look after them. And she would drug the babies and put the babies, now they were asleep, into the basket and ride out of the ghetto. And the reason that she had the Alsatian there is if the baby woke up, she would stamp on the dog's foot, and the barking of the dog would cover the cries of the baby. Not only did Irena do that, Irena then wrote down the names of the children that she had rescued, and she wrote the names down. They're almost, as I told you, through her and through the organisation, 2,500 Jewish children. And she wrote the names on a list and buried, on two lists actually, and buried it in a jar under her neighbour's apple tree. She was actually caught by the Nazis. She was taken to the infamous Paviat prison. She was tortured, her legs were broken, but she didn't say anything about what she had been doing. And she was sentenced to death, but the Żegota organisation was able to bribe the guard and the people who were meant to kill her, and she ended up spending the rest of the time in hiding. When I met Irena, I asked her why she did what she did. And she said, "For the world to be a better place, love and tolerance are necessary. My heart told me to do what I could to help." And so she did. Her story remained largely unknown for many, many years, even to her family. In 1965, she was recognised, which is quite early, as a righteous among the nations, and her name is inscribed on a plaque next to one of the 5 trees at the entrance to Yad Vashem. And that one is this tree here that you can see belongs to Irena Sandler. So there were non-Jewish women who also put their lives on the line in order to help Jewish families and Jewish children. Another interesting resistance movement organised by women are the women of Rosenstrasse, or Rosen Street protest in Berlin. So there were still Jewish men who were married to non-Jewish women in Germany, and they were living in Berlin. And those men were arrested in February and March 1943 and held in Gestapo quarters in Rosenstrasse. So the women went outside Gestapo headquarters and actually protested every single day. And for some reason, and there are a whole lot of historians who sort of can, talk about why, but they were let free. All of those men were released. The men, the husbands, and some of the sons were released. And so I think that we can credit the bravery of these women who protested. And this is a memorial that stands in Rosenstrasse that you can have a look today, and it's also been made into a film. I just thought it was important to highlight that as another example of the bravery of women. I'd like to finish with a couple of, some nice stories to finish with. So we've talked all along about the gendered experiences of women during the Holocaust, and we've talked about the different conditions and what everybody went through. And then the war is over. And the war is over, and there are camps for displaced Jewish persons. There are Jews who come back from the former Soviet Union areas. The Allies, the four Allies, you can see here, there are DP camps in the British zone, the French zone, the Soviet zone, the American zone, and a lot of the camps you can see here in the American zone. And it's so interesting that during the war period, the women had to suppress their identity as women and mothers and caregivers. So once they were in the camps and they were finally free, we know that they sort of wanted to continue with life as it was before the war. If they'd lost people, they wanted to start families again. So a couple of the photos that I just want to finish you off with are photos of babies that are born. There's this absolute incredible baby boom that we see in the camps, and I thought it would be a nice way to actually finish this part of the lecture by having a look at these pregnant women and the babies, and this is from Landsberg in January 1947. So, on the last slide, I want to talk to you about Primo Levi. So Primo Levi was a Holocaust survivor. He survived. He was incarcerated in Auschwitz. He's written his book, If This Is a Man, and Survival at Auschwitz. But in the introduction to his book, he writes this poem or prayer. He calls it the Shema. And it brings us back to women. So his poem starts with, "You who live safe in your warm houses, you who find returning in the evening hot food and friendly faces, consider if this is a man who works in the mud, who does not know peace, who fights for a scrap of bread, who dies because of a yes or a no. Consider if this is a woman without hair and without name, with no more strength to remember, her eyes empty and her womb cold like a frog in winter. Meditate that this came about. I commend these words to you. Carve them in your hearts, at home, in the street, going to bed, rising, repeat them to your children. Or may your house fall apart, may illness impede you, may your children turn their faces from you." I think that's beautiful. And again, Primo Levi recognises that, we have to talk everybody went through hell during the period of the Holocaust, but it was a different kind of hell for women. And he's actually considering that about what it would have been like for women to have gone through this Holocaust. I've got a couple of portraits there of women, but the book that Sarah Helm has written is an excellent book if you want to know more about the experience of women, and she focuses on women in the Ravensbrück concentration camp. And because of Primo Levi, she calls her book If This Is a Woman. So let's go back and just review a couple of things. So as we talked before, and this book, this quote comes from Judy Battalion, who's written a really interesting book called The Light of Days, about women fighters in the Jewish resistance. And she says women made up the vast majority of couriers, a specific role in the heart of operations. They disguised themselves as non-Jews and travelled between locked ghettos and towns, smuggling people, cash, documents, information and weapons, many of which they had obtained themselves. So I've tried to highlight today some of the stories of women who participated in various resistance movements. And on behalf of Dr. Brianne Fallon, we would like to thank you very much for attending this course, and we hope to see you around the museum in the future. Thank you.